Hi, today we are going to talk about professional reasoning and clinical observation. So think about if you can relate to any or maybe all of these statements. Have you ever observed an occupational therapy session and then been stumped by a question you were asked by the practitioner? Have you ever been frustrated or confused by what we call the gray space or the uncertainties talked about OT educators and clinicians? Have you ever wondered how in the world an OT practitioner knows what to do with a particular client? Have you ever spent time observing an OT session and then wondered why you were extremely exhausted, even though all you did all day was watch from the sidelines? And have you ever felt overwhelmed even thinking about how to plan an OT intervention for a client, even in a case study or a hypothetical situation? If so, this session is for you, and you're going to learn some things that might change the way you think and do things as you move towards being a high quality future OT practitioner. So let's get started. All of the things we just talked about are part of what's called clinical or professional. Now, professional reasoning is the overall heading of what's thought about or how practitioners tend to think in the field of occupational therapy. So, one part of professional reasoning is clinical reasoning. That's what you do in a clinical setting. Professional reasoning is the bigger category, and that might include things like professionalism, being on time, being responsible, upholding the code of ethics, things that we've learned about in this class and things that you know and will learn more about going forward. For now, it's important to realize that oftentimes those terms, therapeutic reasoning, clinical reasoning, those are very much synonymous. And oftentimes, professional reasoning is also used in that way, even though it really means a bigger, broader thing than clinical reasoning. So, what is clinical reasoning? It's a process used by practitioners to plan, direct, perform, and reflect on client care. Really, in layman's terms, it's the way we figure out what to do with our clients. Now, I want you to take a minute to watch this little Powtoon that talks about clinical reasoning, the thought process used to evaluate clients and design and then carry out the intervention. And notice that this process involves thinking and feeling and is used to make decisions every step of the way in the OT process. So go ahead and click on the arrow in the middle of the slide to watch the video on clinical reasoning.
Have you ever watched an occupational therapy clinical supervisor? Have you ever watched an occupational therapy clinical supervisor talk to a client? Did it seem really easy and really comfortable? Did your supervisor just seem to know the right questions to ask? And then when it was your turn, you went blank. You didn't know what to say, what questions to ask your client. You felt awkward and uncomfortable, and maybe even a little embarrassed. What does your supervisor know that you don't yet know? What do they have that you want? I'm here to tell you the answer: clinical reasoning skills. Occupational therapists use scientific knowledge and evidence to understand their client's individual situation. This helps them generate questions that need answering, such as, what occupational problems might my client be experiencing? What goals might they want to achieve? What supports do they have here in hospital and at home? What occupational therapy assessments would give me more information about this client? What occupational therapy interventions would be most appropriate and likely to be effective? And finally, how could I measure the effectiveness of my intervention? There's lots of questions to be answered, but the great news is clinical reasoning skills can be learned and developed. How? Start by viewing these online videos before coming to class next week. And I'll start taking you on a journey to learn to think like an occupational therapist.
Created using Powtoon.
I think of clinical reasoning much like learning to ride a bike, in that once that learning process is finished, once the learning is done, that knowledge really becomes ingrained. It becomes part of who we are. When we talk about evidence-based practice, most people think that that means hitting the books, going to the library, or really in this day and age, getting online and finding out what the literature says. And that is part of evidence-based practice, but you'll come across a lot of situations in your practice where you can search and search and search, and you won't find what you're looking for in the research. Maybe it's a rare condition, maybe it's not a rare condition, but just nobody has done a research study that you can find. And so then the question becomes, how do you know what to do with that client? And the answer that relates back to clinical reasoning is you use what you know based on your past experience and your current knowledge. There are specific elements of clinical reasoning, and note that these are on your handout, and you need to be aware of these and think about examples of what each of these are. So the first is the scientific elements. What are the possible things that can be done for this client based on what we know scientifically? So we answer this question when we're dealing with scientific elements of clinical reasoning based on careful and accurate assessment and analysis of the data that we have. This very much relates to evidence-based practice. Now, the next category or set of elements of clinical reasoning is the ethical one. Ethical elements lead us to figure out what should be done ethically. What's the right and fair path to take, considering the client perspectives, performance patterns, and their goals. So we have to think about what is important, what is realistic, what's feasible for this particular client. And last but not least are the artistic elements. And you could think of this as the therapeutic use of self. This is the skillful use of creativity to design and implement therapeutic intervention to support the specific needs of a client. So it includes the therapeutic use of humor, empathy, might include techniques related to coaching, definitely includes the rapport you build with clients, and even the modification of activities according to how you read that specific situation. What's the client's mood? What's their mindset? What's their outlook? And you adjust as you go. So those are the elements of clinical reasoning. And now we're going to talk about the different types of clinical reasoning. Again, this is something to fill in on your handout, so you make sure you have this clear in your head, in your own words. You can find some specific examples about the elements of therapeutic reasoning, like we talked about on the last slide, and you can find more information and the definitions in writing about the types of therapeutic reasoning in the reading in chapter 18. And make sure you have read that because it's very important for you to understand this. But I'll go over it here too. So the first type of clinical reasoning we'll talk about is procedural reasoning. And this is a strategy that OT practitioners use when we look at the diagnosis or condition of a client and then think about, based on that, what types of interventions are most likely to help or facilitate function in that client based on what we know. So with that, we've used the process that kind of reminds me of what you do when you're doing a science fair project. We start with a problem identification, then we have a hypothesis, and we go through setting goals or figuring out what it is we hope to see at the end. And then we do that and circle back and see if we were correct. That's what procedural reasoning is. Next on our list is interactive reasoning. And that's what OT practitioners do to get to know the client as much as we can in the time that we're given with him or her so that we can relate to them as a person. This often usually takes place during the face-to-face interactions between the practitioner and the client. We want to learn about that person's perspective, their point of view, what's most important to them, and if time allows, and if possible, what their fears are and their expectations are based on their experiences, their mindset, their belief system, etc. So this relates back to when we were talking about the different elements, it really relates back to the artistic elements of clinical reasoning, right? Next on our list is conditional reasoning. This is what OTs do. It's the strategy used by OTs when we consider the condition or the diagnosis of the client, and then we start considering the conditions, or in OT speak, the context. So given what we know about a particular diagnosis, we're going to think about the things, the challenges that can or often do come up for people in general with that condition, and then think specifically about the client. So narrow down your focus based on what you know and what you learn about that client's life, where they live, what their home is like, if they work outside the home, what that situation and environment is like. That's what we're looking at when we do conditional reasoning. Narrative reasoning is the next on our list. And I have to say, I kind of think this one's my favorite. It's a strategy that is described as looking at two things. The first one is storytelling, and the second one is story creation. So in storytelling, this is when you might relay information about something that has happened to you or to another client in the past in order to serve a therapeutic purpose. So something that I've realized over the years that I think is really important for us to think about as OT practitioners is that what pretty much every client wants is for us to know what we're doing or to seem like we know what we're doing. And so they hope that we've treated lots and lots of other clients with the same or similar condition, right? They hope that they're one of many in that way. But on the flip side, they hope that they're unique and important as individuals to us. So I think that there's a really important balance that needs to happen between those two things. And I kind of think of them as the yin and the yang of what makes high quality therapy services. Knowing what we're doing because we're familiar with the condition and the challenges that go along with that, but also recognizing the client as a unique individual. And in that way, we might want to tell them stories or even just say, I've seen this a lot, and what I've seen to be most effective is this. And the common challenges that come out when we're doing this intervention are this and this. But we know how to overcome those or to avoid those. And if you can say that type of thing to a client, it really makes them know that you have the expertise you need, the knowledge that you need. It also makes them trust you. The second part, besides storytelling, is story creation. And that's a part of narrative reasoning that I talked about when I said that the client is unique and individual. And that's when we're kind of collecting data, we're doing observation and really taking it in about what works or doesn't work for a particular client. And we let those clients do what is called co-constructing that story. So we're figuring it out together, while at the same time letting them know that you're confident that you can do that. Even if it's a really unique situation, even if you've never seen somebody with that diagnosis before, you've treated other diagnoses with similar problems, and you have the skill set to look things up and figure out what's out there in the literature and what do your colleagues say and do in those kind of situations. So that's how narrative reasoning works. Last but not least is pragmatic reasoning. And that takes into consideration things like the practice setting and your experience as an OT practitioner. So pragmatic means kind of the innuendos, the little pieces or the subtleties of something. And that's why this is called pragmatic reasoning. It's the kind of the hidden things that go into the reasoning, because it's what's in your own brain. It's what you know and what you've learned about the condition and the situation. And then it's the specific innuendos or little details about where you work. Is it outpatient, inpatient, home health, school system, community-based? And that really matters in how we design our intervention. So how does a student develop clinical reasoning skills? How do you get over some of those things we talked about on that very first slide when you're really overwhelmed or confused by figuring out what to do with a particular client? Well, you start off as a novice. That's what you really are expected to do, because you're just starting to learn about those conditions. And even the OT process and the different settings and the goal writing and observation and all those things are new. So it's okay. You're a novice. And your focus then is learning the procedural skills. What do you do in the OT process? You learn the evaluation tools. You learn even language to use and interview skills like we're learning about. And that's what you do at the novice level. Now, in your first year of practice, you really will move into the advanced beginner stage, because you'll have that knowledge from school, and you'll start to boil that down into what's most important in the setting where you work. So you'll learn to recognize additional cues from the environment and from the client and even from caregivers. And you can really start to think about that client as an individual, rather than thinking, okay, when somebody has a stroke in their left parietal lobe, these are the challenges that I'm going to come across. These are the assessment tools I'm going to use. And these are some goals that I've seen used with other people or in case studies with this particular diagnosis. That's a novice level. But in advanced beginner, you're thinking, okay, all of that. But now also, this person is a farmer. And what they want to do are these things. So we need to really focus on, say, safety with heavy machinery, or delegating tasks to others so that safety isn't as much of a concern when that person goes back to farming. That's an example of how an advanced beginner would think. Moving past that, past your first year of practice, you really are moving into the competent area of clinical reasoning. And somebody in that category thinks about the facts and then weighs if those facts are important enough or if they really apply in that situation. So they have a good understanding, a really broad understanding of conditions, assessments, evidence-based practice, and individuals as unique people. Beyond that is the proficient practitioner. We're putting things together on a little more advanced level there because that person has more experience to go on. You've seen things, you've heard things out there. So sometimes you may even see something in the literature and you know from your experience that you're going to question that. Maybe it's not true in the situation that you're working in. Maybe it's only sometimes true, or maybe it is true in some cases, but you haven't seen it or experienced it. And so then you have to figure out what to do using clinical reasoning. And last but not least is the expert practitioner. Those people know and recognize all the rules of the procedures of practice, including the code of ethics, and they have a good grasp of that and a good background themselves in that. And so they're using what they've seen, what they've learned, what they've been taught, what they've read, what they've been told, but they're also using their gut, their intuition, their OT gut is what I think of it as. And that has been developed enough where sometimes you can do things based on what you think is going to be the best. And you might not have to have that solid base of research, or maybe that's not even available, but you are enough of an expert to know in what direction to go with your treatment. So those are the different levels of clinical reasoning skills. We'll talk about more in just a minute how you as an OT student can develop your clinical reasoning skills. But first, let's talk about the clinical reasoning. So these are the steps that you go through when you are doing what we think of as therapeutic reasoning. When you're figuring out what to do with a particular client, of course, you look at that client profile. Then you're going to do the observation. We'll talk about that later on. Then you're going to go through and do specific assessments to collect data, do the measurement, and then you're interpret or analyze those three pieces. Then you will, this is the OT process, you'll figure out what to do to design your intervention, create your goals, and then you'll begin the intervention. And of course, as like within the OT process, you'll collect data and you'll loop back around to determine if what you're doing is the right course of action or if you need to make a shift. So I have a Prezi that goes through how you can, as an OT student, further develop your clinical reasoning skills. So make sure and take a look at that, either right now or when this slideshow is done. Improve your clinical reasoning. And I'm going to put this in as a separate link so you can go through it individually. But don't skip over this. You're going to want to fill this in on your handout and to think about how it is going to apply to you on level 1 field work, level 2 field work, and more courses, and then as a new practitioner. So you can stop this slideshow and go to the Prezi, or you can just finish this and then go to the Prezi. You can decide. Let's talk about clinical observation. That's the second piece of what I want us to talk about in this session. So here's a definition from your O&H book of clinical observation. It's a way of gathering information about a client or an environment by watching and noticing. It's one of the ways we obtain information about an individual client or maybe a population or a community. It includes structured observation. So that means when we give somebody a specific task or activity to do, and then we're observing. And it also includes non-structured observation. So that's when you watch the person just do their usual stuff. And I will say I found so much benefit in that with children if you watch them play. When you can, go to the playground or watch a group of kids play and interact in their natural way. And notice, is there a ringleader? Is there one or more that are off to the side, maybe kind of doing their own thing? Are there any conflicts? Are there rules? And how did those kids figure out those rules? Did they make them up? Are they more kind of dictated by a certain game or by society? Is there any bullying? If so, how does that happen? How does that seem to come about? You can gain so much through both structured and non-structured clinical observations. Sometimes when you're doing clinical observations, you may use a checklist that'll kind of guide you into what you are looking for. An example of a checklist that's used with clinical observation is an assessment tool that I've used a lot called the School Function Assessment, or the SFA. You'll learn about that more in the PEDS courses, but it's a long checklist that has you watch a student in the school doing different kind of everyday things like working the water fountain or holding a door, pushing open a heavy door, sharpening a pencil. And so you look at how they make decisions, how they do things from a motor standpoint and a cognitive standpoint and a collective standpoint. How do they interact with other people? And communication too is big. So you might use a checklist like the SFA. You might just do the observation. You might not have a checklist. Maybe you're just writing down things that you notice that are pretty standard for what you would expect. And then sometimes things that aren't, like different ways that people do things, like maybe an odd way that someone holds their pencil. Or I've worked with kids that can't press the button or even the bar, the handicap accessible bar on a water fountain. So they'll sometimes use their elbow or their hip to do it. And it's really telling because you start to think, well, hey, that's atypical. Maybe there's something going on. Maybe they have some low muscle tone or some weakness or pain that's caused them to develop that pattern of doing that. And so then I know what to dig into a little deeper as I go forward with the evaluation or the intervention. So let's watch a little video, and I want you to observe. Use your clinical observation skills to notice things about what's happening. Clinical observation skills are something that a clinician develops with experience, and one thing that's helpful in that is out louding the process with another clinician. So when you are on field work, it's a good idea if you ask your fieldwork educator to talk about what he or she notices with clients, and think about how your observations and your observation skills can be impacted by that. Go ahead and play the video by clicking on the arrow on the slide and listen to the clinician talk through the observation.
Okay, clinical observations are something that you're going to be
Let's try that again. Now it's time for everybody's favorite. Hold on, let me try.
observations are something that you're going to be looking for, whether it's during an evaluation or doing a treatment session. You're always watching for symmetry of the body and motor control, how a child is able to go from one step to the next, what their visual attention is to you. Can they maintain eye contact with you while you're playing and engaging? One way to try and elicit that eye contact is to get right in front of the child and use some vestibular input to see if you can't get him to look right in your eyes. Obviously, you can see this child's very easily distracted in this environment, so he's having a hard time maintaining that eye contact during their session. He's also got a lot of motor overflow. He's clearly very, excited and overstimulated. So we're going to want to do some activities that can help to ground him a little bit more so he can focus and pay attention. This is an example of a hanging obstacle course going from one step to the next, which is providing a great combination of both vestibular input as well as proprioception. Now we're during a testing situation in between tasks, and here's where you can see a lot of distraction as well. You can provide some free time and let the child just see how he's going to do on his own and get a lot of input from that as well. This little guy is seeking out a lot of proprioception. He's very distracted and loves this ball, but he's using it to really put some deep input into his chest as he rolls it over the chair while his tester is getting ready for their eval. Now they're in the gym, and she's going to attempt to get him to do some tasks that are on the Dick Angie Burke. And meanwhile, you can see again, he's really needs a lot of that proprioceptive input. So not only do you see that in the testing situation, but also in the gym. Here we're trying to elicit that prone extension, and he doesn't quite have that integrated yet, so his legs are flexed. He's sitting in a W-sit position, so you're going to want to check on those joints and see if they're hypermobile at all. He's clearly having a great time, but again, organizing his body is a little bit more of a challenge than we would expect. So there he is, nice prone extension, although she's got to get her hands up a little bit higher to get his head up and his arms out. She's checking his trunk control, just doing some different positions. We're actually looking in the window. She's trying to get his visual attention so he can focus ahead and really get that head up. Watch your body mechanics while you're doing this so you protect your own back.
Now it's time for everybody's favorite Kahoot. The challenge pin for this one is 088-43121. And you have until Sunday night at midnight, that's Sunday, April 19th, to complete this. This is just for practice. Remember now that there is a quiz that will be for this knowledge check. It's going to be graded on a complete or incomplete basis. So as long as you take it, by Sunday night at midnight, you will get the credit. And as we close things up, let me say that when it comes to clinical reasoning, that ties so much to the assessment or the A part of a SOAP note. And so with your documentation, you always want to be very objective and let that paint the picture rather than a subjectivity or bias that may be present in your words. So if you call somebody non-compliant, that is painting a picture that may not be the whole truth. Instead, say what you see, say what you know to be true. Use words that describe that can't be misinterpreted. And finally, we have the reference list. Again, make sure you have read the chapter in the O&H book and use that to help you complete your note-taking guide, as that will help you very much going forward. Thank you for your attention.